Good evening, everyone. I'm so pleased to be with you tonight. That was really a gracious, wonderful introduction. I almost can't wait to hear what I have to say myself now, after hearing all those kind words. Not very well deserved. I have to say, too, that on my way down here, as I was preparing the talk, I was considering whether to do a PowerPoint presentation, and I'm sort of glad now that a moment of confirmation, perhaps, on my choice. I can talk fast. I don't think I can talk quite that fast what I just saw. Well, it really is a very special occasion. We've been talking about the history of this past 100 years, and one of the fascinating things about us as human beings is how interested we are in where we came from. This seems to be part of the human condition wherever we are, wherever you go around the world. It's quite interesting that we Americans are no exception to that, even though our national history, even though we come from all over the world, and of course there were indigenous people before us here in this land, nevertheless our national history doesn't go back very far, just a couple of centuries. And so this 100 years that we're talking about represents nearly half of the span of the United States itself. So it's really quite remarkable to think about that. We're not Egyptians, and we're not Chinese with these ancient backgrounds, or Persians. Well, I mean, we're not all Persians, that are here anyway. And it's a very interesting thing, and there's a certain unique thing, I think, about the American interest in our history. Of course, we've always, in every generation, been asking ourselves, who are we and where have we come from? Because, of course, an idea of our story gives us a sense of our identity and our place in the world, and also a sense of what it is that has been achieved by our forebears, and where we then carry the story forward from here. That is, whatever they did and whatever momentum or progress they made sets the stage for what our own generation then can do. And it's really quite interesting to see how interested we are as Americans in this question. If you go to any bookstore these days, you'll find virtually a cornucopia of books about the American Revolution and the Founding Fathers and the Civil War. And in recent years, several of these volumes have actually made the New York Times bestseller list. Several about Washington and Franklin, one on Jefferson, one on Hamilton, one on Woodrow Wilson, all just in the last couple of years. In fact, this year there was a musical about Alexander Hamilton. I don't know if you've heard about that, but it swept the Tony Awards in New York. And there's also a great interest in Lincoln, the movie that came out a few years ago. And so we might ask ourselves, why are we so interested in all of this? Why do we keep asking about the history of America? Why do we think so much about our origins as a nation, especially these days? But I think the answer is really pretty straightforward, because we're living in times of rapid change, and to a degree perhaps an increasing uncertainty. At home, we are faced with challenges where, even though we can see a certain degree of progress, in other respects seem to stay stubbornly with us and not want to go away. Many worry that we're actually losing ground in certain areas, our war against poverty, that possibly we're backsliding in our war against racial prejudice and oppression, that we're not doing enough in our struggle to provide education for our young ones and health care for the poor. And we look abroad and we find similar situations. We find a world in chaos that seems to be getting more tense every day. And so it's natural that we should ask ourselves, what is our role in the world? What does it mean in this day and time to struggle for freedom and for equality? In fact, we might even ask, what is America for? What is it really about? And it's perfectly understandable then to turn to our forebears, because we know that they possessed a very keen sense of mission. Many of the founders considered the American experience, the American experiment, one that was ordained by God Himself, because the very existence of the United States, against such seemingly impossible odds that led to its origin, seemed to them to be a miracle in the most literal sense of the word. So that attitude that America had a special role in the world can be traced all the way back to colonial times. And we remember the idea, for example, expressed by the Puritans, establishing the Massachusetts Bay Colony, that they were creating a city on a hill, as they put it, an ideal Christian community and an example to the entire world. And this notion seemed to Americans to be confirmed when we won our independence. As Thomas Paine, who was British but became an American, put it, "The past," as he wrote, "is the textbook of tyranny. The future is the Bible of the free." And this he meant quite literally. In other words, he, like many others, believed that world history had reached a turning point with the creation of the United States, and that its destiny would be to find itself in the vanguard of nations that would establish freedom all over the world. What was interesting about this whole thing is that America was the first nation that was founded on an idea. The idea that all men are created equal and are endowed by God with inalienable rights, these immortal words from the Declaration of Independence. But there's a great difference between the idea of America and the story of America. If the idea of America is that all are equal, the story of America is the struggle to live up to that vision. For we have had to deal from the beginning with fundamental contradictions between our principles and the reality of our society. The story of America is punctuated by important steps forward as well as with disastrous setbacks. It is replete with horrific tragedy and noble triumph. It is characterized by the meanest acts of selfishness as well as by the most heroic deeds of self-sacrifice. But above all, the story tells us that the idea of America has refused to die. Among the lessons we've learned is that freedom, justice, and equality are not givens. They don't come to us as historical inevitabilities. They depend upon people of goodwill who are willing to work, to sacrifice, and even sometimes to die for them. Justice happens not of its own accord, but when people strive to make it happen. Remember when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was jailed in Birmingham in 1963 and responded in a very famous letter from the Birmingham jail to an open letter that had been addressed to him by a group of white clergymen who counseled Dr. King to stop his activities. They asked him for patience, to allow time to take care of the problem of injustice. But his rejoinder was that progress does not roll in, as he wrote, does not roll in on wheels of inevitability. Rather, progress comes about when people act as God's agents in the world, struggling for the right. Another lesson is the need for every generation to engage in that process of justice. Every new generation must learn to understand right and wrong and act accordingly. Although we may greatly benefit from the deeds of our forebears, nevertheless, we must carry the torch for ourselves. Just as any child cannot continue forever to depend upon his parents to make his moral decisions for him, neither can we rest upon the work of our predecessors. To illustrate that point, I'd like to share with you the result of a little research I did. Now, it was mentioned that I'm a Southerner, and I am. I grew up in Augusta, Georgia, which is very well known for the Masters golf tournament, and well, for the Masters golf tournament, I'll leave it at that. I guess that's just about all it's known for. And I'm a third-generation Baha'i, so my mother was a Baha'i, but also her mother was a Baha'i. But I grew up in this southern environment, and I had an interest in my own history of my town. So one of the things I did, which you can now do thanks to the world we live in online, is that I was able to go through the local newspaper, the Augusta Chronicle, spanning the years from the beginning of the 20th century until the mid-1960s, about the time of the Voting Rights Act. And one of the striking things about that experience, which I think would be very near the experience of Nashville, which is why I'm bringing it up, is to see, on the one hand, how dramatically things have changed for the better, yet at the same time, it's stunning to observe how frequently the editors and writers would bewail the injustices of past generations while remaining seemingly blind to the injustices going on all around them in their own day. So, for example, in the 1910s, so about the time when the Baha'i faith came to Nashville, A great many articles expressed gratitude that the evil of slavery had been abolished, yet also counseled the Negroes of their own generation of that time to be patient, with claims to the effect that things are much better now. Couldn't understand why there was any agitation over anything, because we don't have slavery anymore, things are much better. And this was at the very time when the state of Georgia led the country in lynching of black people. But things were okay, be patient. Decades later, in the 1940s, the Augusta Chronicle, in the editorial pages, expressed great satisfaction at the recent passing of an anti-lynching bill and bemoaned the days of such widespread lawless violence against black people. But the paper also counseled black people to be patient, not to agitate for civil rights. Things are okay now. That's an actual quote. Things are okay now. Never mind that Jim Crow was alive and well at that time, and that black people throughout the South lived in a state of complete segregation and all kinds of injustice. Then came the Civil Rights era. This is when I came along, in the late 50s and early 60s. And once again, the paper bewailed the injustices of the past, yet seemed oblivious to what was going on around them in the present. And I say all of this just to make a point, or really to raise a question. And the question is to ask whether it is possible that we, like our predecessors, have the same capacity to see and bemoan the injustices of the past while remaining insensitive to what's going on all around us today. The historical record seems to suggest that that's probable, not just possible. Now, I don't ask that question to the people who know what it is to suffer from that prejudice. They can tell you all about it. It's really more the people who don't have to suffer from it, who have to open their hearts and really think about this in a more serious way. Another lesson has to do with the role of religion. Many of us here today would describe ourselves as religious people, and there's no denying that religion has played an extremely important role in American history, but particularly in the South. But we have to acknowledge that the contribution of religion has not always been a constructive one. Religion has been used to justify abuses of the worst sort, including slavery itself. We all know, for example, that Southern slaveholders defended the institution by citing chapter and verse from the Bible. Later, it was used to defend Jim Crow, and even in my own day, I can remember people fresh out of Sunday school telling me how they had learned about white supremacy from the Bible in Sunday school. So we have to admit to these abuses that were perpetrated in the name of God, and wonder why religion, which should have been in the vanguard of the forces of progress, has so often taken up the rear, and why to this very day the Sunday hour of worship, which Dr. King called our attention to, a time when we all celebrate God, is still the most segregated hour of the week. Having said that, though, we also have to acknowledge another truth about religion. That is the power of religion at its best. True religion offers us important insights and imparts a moral strength, a courage, a sense of self-sacrifice that nothing else can inspire. True religion reminds us that we are all God's children. True religion emphasizes the importance of personal rectitude. It calls upon us to bring our personal and social lives into accordance with the principles of justice and unity. It demands that we unite for the purpose of creating a better society, wherein each individual can live up to his or her true potential. It gives us the power to transform our hearts and our attitudes, a transformation that precedes all progress. And most of all, it assures us that there is a God who cares about us, whose will is that justice be established in the world, and who comes to the assistance of any person, however humble, who dedicates himself to the cause of universal brotherhood. The civil rights movement itself is a wonderful case in point, because we all know that it was largely a phenomenon inspired by the spirit of religion. Dr. King. Baha'u'llah, the founder of the Bahá'í faith, regarded by his followers as God's messenger for today, lived and died in the 19th century. He never visited the United States, yet Amazingly, he indicated that America would play a preponderating role in the establishment of world peace. He clearly foresaw America's rise to world preeminence, even though it was not one of the world powers of his day. But he also made clear that America's leadership abroad would depend upon its ability to achieve the capacity to deal with injustice at home. And of course, it's quite reasonable that if we aspire to exert moral leadership in the forum of nations, we must also work together to establish bonds of brotherhood and unity, inspiration and example. So it's up to us in our own lives to create models of unity in our personal attitudes, in our relations with others, and building a just community. So it was with this vision in their hearts that the earliest members of the Baha'i faith came to the South in the early years of the 20th century, including to Nashville a century ago. And I'll mention in passing that Louis Gregory also was the first Baha'i to go to my hometown, Augusta, Georgia. So we have that in common. Even those of us who were raised in the South might find it hard truly to understand the virtually impenetrable social barriers that separated black and white races in those years. It would indeed have been very hard to imagine any power that could have overcome the long ingrained prejudices and practices of the day. Everything in society seemed to conspire against interracial fellowship. The educational system, the media, politics, religion, and indeed in all the manners and well-established mores of the time, which when violated often were enforced with brutal and physical clarity, as we also know. Yet, nevertheless, there were those of many religions, not just Baha'is, many people, who had the courage to question the received customs, who recognized their injustice, and who courageously spoke out. Some are well known to history, but the majority were simply the humble, everyday citizens who did what they could within their own personal circumstances to live according to a new vision and to strive to create a new pattern of community life. But among these were the Baha'is. I can't go into the specifics of the history of Nashville. This has already been beautifully done by Antoinette. But I can relate my own experience growing up in Augusta, which I think was essentially the same as here, and I can do it because it's my own personal experience. As I said, my maternal grandmother was the first Baha'i in my family. She was the granddaughter of Confederate soldiers and slaveholders on both sides. She grew up in the home of her grandfather, who had been an officer and a slave owner during the Civil War, until Sherman came through, and was raised with all of the beliefs and the assumptions that one might expect of someone of her time and her class. But nevertheless, as a young woman, she had several experiences that awoke her to the realities of the injustices in her society, particularly the racial injustices. But she became convinced that these could only be resolved, so insuperable did they seem, through the power of God. In the Baha'is, she finally met a group of people who seemed really to be struggling to live this principle of racial unity, including being for many years the only religious community to hold integrated meetings, and I mean well before Jim Crow was abolished. So she gave her heart to the Baha'i faith and raised her daughters, her two daughters, as Baha'is also. And it's worth noting here at this point, she was also very close friends with Susie Langford, and the two became Baha'is. So they were seekers together and became Baha'is together. Susie is, for those who don't know, was a Baha'i who lived for many years in Nashville. So by the time I came along, it was the 1960s, a period well known to all of us for the changes taking place across the country, particularly with regard to race. Yet still, it seemed that virtually everything and everyone in the greater world had the same message, that black and white could never live in fellowship, could never get along, could never be brothers and sisters. And this is what I heard every day growing up. In fact, I'll go ahead and add that, my brother and I were routinely beaten up for having black people to our home as friends. And our birthdays were boycotted because the parents in the neighborhood feared, correctly, that we would invite black people to our birthday parties. I mean, nothing to fear in having black people, but I mean, you know what I mean. It's just that's what we did. And we didn't stop because of the boycott, as it were, of the birthday parties. And so it was really quite an experience to grow up with that perspective in those times. And I had this smaller world, which was the community of the Baha'is and their friends. And in this world, I saw quite a different thing. It was people of all races coming together who truly were friends, and as far as I could see, all of them were my family. All of them equally were my family. People who came together, who served, who worshiped, who worked together to fulfill this vision of a united world. And in a sense, if we think of it as sort of a dream, well, it was a dream already coming true, if on a small scale. But it was my world. It was the world that I had. And it gave me hope in the potential for human beings to overcome the past, overcome all of these prejudices. Of course, this was just the perspective of a child. As a child, I did not appreciate the struggle that this took, the sacrifices that it meant, the conscious battle that each of the Baha'is and their friends surely had within themselves to overcome lifetimes of ingrained mistrust, prejudice, anger. I didn't appreciate how hard it must have been to close that sense of distance between human hearts, to cross the barriers which in 1,000 ways expressed the mores and the mannerisms of the day, and which had to be consciously struggled against and overcome against the weight of all public opinion and in certain cases open hostility. I mean, even to the point where my family and I were threatened by shotguns and dynamite at the meetings that we would have, people coming in. I mean, to that degree. But as a child, even if I didn't understand all of that, I saw what really mattered. I saw that in spite of the imperfections that they all had, no doubt, there was a sincere desire to be different and to create a different world. And I saw that they could actually do it. In other words, I guess I would say, I felt a love that knew no bounds. And it was there, it was real. And it was what set the pattern of my life, really, and as limited as my life might have been, it was the most influential thing and the greatest thing that could possibly have happened. So just talk a little bit more about what the Baha'is believed. You've got this sense of race. Baha'u'llah had an interesting analysis of human history. Baha'u'llah taught that humanity today is fast approaching the consummation of a process that has been in progress for thousands of years, punctuated by distinct stages of social and intellectual and spiritual development, each of which has gradually brought us collectively from relative infancy to the threshold of our collective maturity as the human race. Just as any individual, we might say, has to pass through a stage of adolescence, so too, we, together, humanity, are in the midst of this transition from adolescence to adulthood, in which new powers and new capacities are being discovered. But just like an adolescent, that transition is marked by great turbulence as we struggle towards true adulthood. We're learning to put aside habits of thought and behaviors that characterized our childhood, but which now must be considered as obsolete and have to be set aside in the face of the demands of a new stage in our existence. One might say, in other words, that we're now facing the conflict of our old assumptions and our old concepts with the new requirements of life together in a global community. Evidence of the outdated concepts is all around us, of course, and we see their effects in the form of excessive nationalism and racism and materialism and other troubles that frustrate our attempts at creating justice in the world. But as devastating as those problems are, the process as a whole also is having a positive effect, sweeping away the barriers that block humanity's progress, causing us to re-examine those assumptions, creating openings and space for the process of integration to draw diverse groups together and disclosing new opportunities for cooperation and for collaboration. So no matter how bleak the immediate horizon may have been, Baha'u'llah was confident in the brightness of the ultimate outcome. Human affairs, as he put it, will be utterly reorganized and an era of universal peace inaugurated that will be founded upon certain fundamental principles. And the most important fundamental principle of them all is the concept of the oneness of humankind. Now, this is a notion that has not existed throughout history. For most of our history, as a species, the idea that we are all members of one family who should enjoy the same rights and benefits in life was not accepted by most of the people of the world. But today, thank goodness, the notion that humanity constitutes a single people is a truth that now claims widespread acceptance. But it's not enough simply to accept the notion without exploring its implications for society. For example, to accept the premise of human oneness renders intolerable all forms of prejudice. Among these, though, are not just racial prejudice, but also the biases that prevent women from fulfilling their potential and engaging in various fields of endeavor shoulder to shoulder with men. Baha'u'llah also taught that just as human reality is one, creation as a whole is one, and therefore science and religion are two not competing systems of thought, but two complementary systems of knowledge and practice by which human beings come to understand the world around them and through which civilization advances. Each, he said, depends upon the other. Religion without science soon degenerates into superstition and fanaticism. But on the other hand, science without religion soon becomes the tool of crude materialism. Prosperity in the best sense requires then coherence between our spiritual values and our material pursuits. After all, it's such values as justice which allow us to distinguish truth from falsehood and guide the investigation of reality, physical reality, but also social reality, and which act as our compass in finding the way. And to the extent that we can appreciate that all human beings are more than just physical beings, that each is endowed by a loving Creator with a soul capable of reflecting His attributes of love, of mercy, of creativity and intellectual discovery, the more we appreciate that service to others is the very definition of a life well lived. As Baha'u'llah stated, work performed in the spirit of service to one's fellow human beings is itself a form of prayer, a means of worshiping God. Now, needless to say, it's one thing to subscribe to these beliefs, but quite another to actually build a society that reflects them. In other words, we have to learn and we have to gain the capacity to do this. The Baha'is have an approach that's characterized by action, reflection, consultation, study of the Word of God, and all of this as an inquiry into the nature of the relationships that bind the individual, the community, and the institutions of society. Baha'u'llah did not share the assumption that relations among society and institutions and individuals will inevitably be characterized by selfishness, aggression, and competition. This, according to Baha'u'llah, would ignore the extraordinary potential of the human spirit, which is capable of harmonious interactions, which can foster a civilization befitting a mature humanity. Cooperation was the watchword for Baha'u'llah, not competition. Just as the viability of every cell, if we can use sort of the human body as imagining it as a metaphor for the body of humanity, just as any cell and any organ in the human body is contingent upon the health of the body as a whole for its own benefit, so should the prosperity of every individual, every family, every people be sought in the well-being of the entire human race, for the body to be whole and for the body to be well. In this effort, then, spiritual principles play a key role in inspiring collaborative action. Individuals together learn to appreciate the value of such concepts as unity, of love, of humble service, and of deeds motivated by sincerity. This, again, is religion in its true and higher sense. This is more than a set of mere beliefs or tradition that one clings to and obeys without thinking. Rather, it's an essential instrument of human progress, of knowledge, and a dynamic force for social liberation. It's conducive to unity, to fellowship, and harmony, and is compatible with science. The difference between the true spirit of religion and superstition or fanaticism is similar to the difference between the true science of medicine and mere quackery. The Baha'is believe that the Baha'is don't own this, that all of the great religions of the world essentially are the same. All of them essentially teach us the same truths about ourselves and about our relationship with each other and with God. All share a more or less equivalent moral and ethical value system, and all in their true form, in their higher form, can and will contribute to the process of peace. Not only here in Nashville, not only here in the United States, there are Baha'i communities all around the globe, and in Asia, Africa, South America, Europe, North America, throughout the islands of the Pacific, and in other places. People of all classes and of all races and of all religious backgrounds are coming together in a systematic effort to build communities that are founded on the values that we've described this evening, with the goal of spiritual and material prosperity, in coherence with each other, and served by consultative institutions and processes freely and openly elected. It's not uncommon, in fact, to find the majority of participants in these communities are not members of the Baha'i faith, but others, but all are involved in making their full and legitimate contributions. The great source of hope that the Baha'is see in this experience is that when people come together in bonds of friendship, learning each other's aspirations and points of view, pursuing common goals inspired by values of brotherhood and service, engaging in meaningful discussion and systematic action in building better communities, honoring both the fundamental spiritual unity of its members and the infinite diversity of the talents that they represent, marvelous opportunities soon open before their eyes. With better understanding of the forces at work in society that operate either for good or for ill, they are more able to remove the obstacles to progress, overcome past prejudices, limited visions, or systemic injustices, and release new floods of human potential into the world. Now, my time this evening doesn't allow doing justice to the theme, but I hope that in this brief description, you'll see why the Baha'is see in this experience the vision of a united world taking shape under the influence of these principles. And we're confident that there are countless other like-minded people of all backgrounds, from every religion or from no particular religion, who share this vision and who are destined to contribute to the onward progress of humanity and to the ultimate achievement of a united world. I'll conclude my remarks with a few words about Baha'u'llah himself. History has many examples of people who promoted such values as love and justice, but whose own behavior revealed them to be lacking in the very qualities that they so highly praised. This is certainly true in the political world, as we know, but perhaps especially true where religious leaders are concerned. So it's important for us to be able to distinguish between those who sincerely lived what they taught and those who have appealed to the spiritual aspirations of others only for their own advantage. But the briefest examination of Baha'u'llah's life reveals the example of moral courage and spiritual distinction that he set, and which, far from being ignored, should be studied and appreciated by everyone. Baha'u'llah was born into a very wealthy and prominent family, a position from which every worldly advantage was open to him in terms of political position, riches, and esteem. Yet, from a young age, he demonstrated an unusual interest in issues of spirituality and social justice, and preferred a life of humanitarianism and philanthropy, for which he became renowned even as a young man, earning the title by which he was locally known, the Father of the Poor. This sense in him of justice and compassion only grew through the years, until the time came when he forsook all of the prerogatives of his birthright for the sake of his religious mission. Instead of a life of privilege, he instead endured torture, successive imprisonments, and ultimately exile at the combined instigation of the religious and civil leaders of his home country, Iran. From his initial banishment to Baghdad, he later was exiled further to Istanbul, Edirne, and finally to the prison city of Akka, in what was then the Ottoman province of Syria, but today is the state of Israel. And it was there where he spent his final years as a prisoner of the Ottoman government. Throughout all of these difficulties, He demonstrated an unwavering adherence to principle, steadfast courage, and almost superhuman endurance. His was an example of sacrifice for the greater good of humanity, such as can be found only among the great reformers and spiritual leaders of history. His companions in exile included the members of his immediate family, most notably his son Abdu'l-Baha. At the age of 8, Abdu'l-Baha accompanied his father into exile from Iran and remained a prisoner of the Ottomans until many years after his father's death. He was finally granted his freedom at the age of 64, after 56 years of great hardship. And in the years remaining to him, he devoted his life to spreading Baha'u'llah's teachings, even undertaking a journey through Europe and North America for that purpose, during which he spoke at countless houses of worship of different religions, progressive societies, and organizations for the promotion of human welfare. The record is open for anyone to investigate, and those doing so will note how universally he was praised, not only for his high ideals, but for the extraordinary personal example he set of love, of compassion, of humanitarianism, and many other outstanding qualities that he had. And in fact, it was chiefly his own personal example, his uncompromising demand that people live according to these teachings, that inspired Louis Gregory and other early Baha'is to come to the South, where this understanding was badly needed and which was the foundation upon which the Baha'i community of Nashville was built. So in Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Baha, we have people who lived their beliefs and who set an example so worthy of emulation as to be a source of pride to all posterity. We Baha'is join with all people of goodwill in the hope that together we can build a better America and a better world that embodies the principle enunciated by Baha'u'llah a century ago. The earth is but one country, and mankind its citizens. Thank you.